It's a really nice day, living in the right space. Breathing your grace, got me feeling some kind of way.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Kim from Good News Mental Health Podcast, and I have here licensed family and marriage therapist Beatrice, and also my dear friend in San Antonio, Texas. So I'm so excited about this episode because today we're going to talk about our story on mental health issues and struggles in the context of a family and their opinions, and maybe church and their opinions, and how we have come to our own conclusions on when to seek help and when it was not okay. So, Beatrice, thank you so much for being here. And I'm
Thank
so
you for
excited.
inviting me.
Beatrice, can you tell me a little bit about you and what you do and how you became a therapist?
Yeah, so I was born and raised here in San Antonio. I went to school at a little private liberal arts Christian college in Indiana. I studied psychology and decided I wanted to be a therapist. So later I decided specifically marriage and family therapist because I really like working with couples. But I do see individuals, and I'm in private practice here in San Antonio and have been since 2016.
That's awesome. And Beatrice and I met through kind of like, I have my private practice too in Texas, and we just connected, but I really liked her work with EMDR therapy, specifically with trauma. And also, I just really liked Beatrice's passion of destigmatizing mental health struggles, especially in the Christian context. So, Beatrice, can you just kind of fill us in on like what your passion, where your passion came from?
I think, that when you've actually experienced a mental health issue, which I've had 2 episodes of depression, one of them being a postpartum depression, but both of them were kind of triggered by some trauma, it kind of gives you some compassion and great understanding for people who are experiencing any kind of mental illness or any kind of illness at all. So I think that kind of helped me really have a passion for helping people. And I grew up in the church, and, I think that we as a church have a great opportunity to help people who are struggling with mental illness, but there is just a great misunderstanding about it. And so we don't know how to help. And so I'm just hoping to be a part of that, helping the church understand how they can help.
And I definitely have a few examples on my own, but what were some of the maybe not so accurate and not so helpful opinions in the church that you experienced?
So one of them, and I think it's probably the most important one, is that, I heard the argument that the Word of God is all sufficient. So if you're struggling with mental illness, then you need to be in the Word. And I'm not saying that the Word of God isn't all sufficient. Of course it is. But what if my problem isn't all spiritual? What if my problem is brain chemistry? What if my problem
Mm-hmm.
is something that I inherited and I don't have control over it? Maybe I have prayed and God hasn't chosen to heal me in that way. So I need to seek a different kind of help other than spiritual help when it's been going on for a long time. It's beginning to affect me daily. I'm becoming frustrated because I can't help myself, no matter how much, I am in the Word or how much I'm praying, right? So just kind of like with a toothache or with diabetes, if my praying and my Bible reading isn't helping, then maybe I need to seek a different kind of help. And, I think one of the problems in the church is that we have created this belief that all problems are spiritual problems. And maybe there's a spiritual component to each one of our problems, but not all of our problems are spiritual. Just like I said, with the toothache and with diabetes, those are not spiritual problems. So we need a
Right.
different kind of help, you know? And I think people are afraid to seek that because we're told, we need to pray and read your Bible more. And I'm not saying that, those aren't good things, but sometimes we just need a different kind of help and we're afraid to ask for that.
The Bible passage that I was kind of thinking about was when there was a child that was ill, and the Pharisees were asking Jesus, is it because of his sins or his parents' sin? And Jesus like, this has nothing to do with sin. And I agree with you. Sin has a different context, right? And I know that we're going theologically here, but there is a state of sin and a brokenness that we're all born into, which
Mm-hmm.
is a condition. It's not something that we did to deserve it or not. We're just born into this condition of brokenness. And I think, if you go like genetically, over time, genes are supposed to, over time be broken. And that's why we have a lot of illnesses and diabetes, and organs are not functioning right, the older you get. And these are just natural conditions. And I think mental health has such a equal component of that, that we're born into this brokenness with trauma. Hello, like it just happens to all of us. Inadequate upbringing, hurtful, opinions or, values that was passed down, these kind of cognitive distortions that's passed down generations. And it's really hard to say, oh, you need to pray more or read more Bible to cure all these aspects of that. Just like you said, spirituality is component of that, but there's genetics, there's, biochemistry, there's even spiritually, there's just a condition of brokenness that we're experiencing.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is we're spirit, mind, and body. So,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we can have a spiritual problem and that needs to be addressed, but sometimes if we have even a physical problem, it affects the other ones. It affects the spiritual, it affects the mental, right? So if I have a chronic illness and I've been suffering with that for a long time, it's making me feel physically, ill, and that doesn't feel good. Sometimes that bleeds over into, my emotional. And so I start to maybe feel depressed because I start
Mm-hmm.
thinking things like this is never going to get better. And I think God has left me. So now it's bled over into the spiritual, right? So I start to feel depressed. I start to feel hopeless, negative, critical. And then it bleeds over into the spiritual. God doesn't care about me. So we're spirit, mind, and body. And just like our body can malfunction, and that can happen because of trauma or because of age or genetics, right? Once that happens, then it can affect the other three, right? And so we have to be mindful of treating all three. Sometimes our problem is spiritual. Sometimes, so maybe we see a pastor, we go to a spiritual mentor, but sometimes it's physical and we need to see a doctor. And other times it's mental and we need to see a mental health professional. And I just think that it would be great if in the Christian community that we encourage people to seek whatever kind of help that they need. Now, we are encouraged to seek godly counsel, so you need to be careful, like who you are seeking godly and who you're seeking counsel from. But it's
Mm-hmm.
okay. It's okay to seek mental health because sometimes our brain and our way of thinking is not functioning optimally. We need help.
Right. Just like if you had like a broken bone, you wouldn't go to your pastor to fix it, or you would tell them that they need to do certain things and this is your cross, carry it. It's like sometimes the solutions has a rightful source, and God designed all of those specialties within medicine and also within, psychology and mental health providers to go there. And I was just kind of thinking when you said that, spirit, mind, and body connection is so cool because you can flip that dialogue around. And if you really understood that a lot of things that's going on in your life is not your fault, right? We're just born into this world that's already broken, but there's a hope on the other side, right? And then what is happening to you and the problems you have, there's some that you do to yourself, right? Like action,
Yes.
whatever, but it's not 100% all your fault, and then protect that sense of worth. I think if Christianity starts to embrace that, the fact that, hey, this is just what is supposed to happen, and you're not, you know, condemned by it. Jesus was a more of grace, right? Like, I don't condemn you anymore. Now turn around and move the other way, right? If we embrace that spirit of forgiveness and more accurate understanding of the problems, I feel like that spirit solution can bleed into the mental issues and also physical issues. I think it can go the other way to be hopeful.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if we, as the church, were known as a place where you could go and you could talk about what you're struggling with, whether it is physical or mental, and you wouldn't be condemned. We'd be like, how people go to the church because they know we have food pantries, right? A lot of people are like,
Mm-hmm.
you need food. Most churches have food pantries. It'd be great if we were known as people who we may not understand every mental illness. I don't understand every mental illness, but if our first response was compassion and seeking to understand, and I may not know how to help you, but I'll be on the journey with you to try to figure out how to get help, right? And just ask questions, right? To try to seek to understand. It would be great if we were known for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you kind of going back to the arguments that we encountered, right? It's like, oh, you need to pray more, or how dare you to be anxious? God is taking care of everything, and
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like gaslighting a little bit, using scripture to gaslight the struggles, that we are supposed to have, right? There is an understanding that all problems can be fixed. And I think that's also the fuel to the fire in misunderstanding mental health in church, because like, you're anxious. Well, if you prayed more or if you had more faith, then you wouldn't be anxious, right? That on this side of the world, you know, all the problems can be fixed. And you're right. It's like, yes, God can fix things, but Paul is very clear that there are some thorns in their flesh that God refused to take away for a
Mm-hmm.
purpose, and I feel like every time that I'm sure that you experience this too, every time that I encounter, patients and their stories, there's so much brokenness. But at the same time, if I had the accurate understanding of like, okay, this is not their fault, not all their fault, right? And then I tell them that, the message of grace, like, hey, this is like, if I went through what you went through, right? And we're all broken beings, like, I would probably struggle with same things or even more than what you're struggling with, right? That gives people hope. And they become like, okay, like, I'm struggling with depression, but that's okay. Like, the burden becomes a little bit lighter when you don't expect that, well, you're anxious and you're still depressed because you're not doing more stuff.
I think sometimes, God, he can definitely heal instantly. He can, boom, raise his hand and we are healed. But I think sometimes, most of the time, he wants us to go through a process, right? And to learn some things. And like you said, sometimes we're not healed. Sometimes we continue with whatever illness we're struggling with. But it's nice to know, that there are people who can help us in our process. And a lot of us who are in the mental health field feel called to that. Like, this is something
Mm-hmm.
that God has given us gifting for, and we want to help. And so we want to be part of that process. And a part of that process is maybe talking about, are there things that you might have done that have caused you to be where you're at?
Mm-hmm.
But maybe not. Maybe this is
Mm-hmm.
genetic. And I think too, like, as we're talking about depression specifically, it's really helpful to understand that there is depression, the illness, and then there is depression, the emotion. And it's kind of like on a spectrum, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so when we're talking about the emotion, which can also be part of the illness, that's something that everybody experiences, right? We all kind of experience times where we feel sad, but usually we can pull ourselves out of that, right? I can go do something. I can change my environment. I can call a friend, and I feel better after I do that. But as we move to the other end of the spectrum, now we're talking about an illness that involves brain chemistry that most likely is going to require some medication. When we get to that end, that's when people, they can pray all they want and they can have people praying for them and they can be reading scripture. But ultimately, they're going to probably need to see a therapist and a psychiatrist,
Mm-hmm.
someone who can help them to process through what they're feeling and what they're experiencing, and then help them with the symptoms. When I was going through my episodes of depression, I had a hard time seeing God. I really could not see God. I thought God had abandoned me. I thought he doesn't care. But when I actually got on the medication and my symptoms were able to be under control, I actually was able to see God more clearly. I felt better. My mind was functioning more clearly. And then I could hear when people would say spiritual things to me. But before that, my mind was just not functioning well and it didn't feel good emotionally or physically. And so, telling me, shaming me, or making me feel guilty for not doing, I don't know, whatever that is. You need to pray more. You need to be in church more. You need to, be reading God's word more. It didn't help. And shame and fear usually doesn't lead to good things. It leads to people
No.
not being able to know God's love because it brings fear, right? Shame and guilt brings fear and
Yeah.
lack of
And that was
trust.
like the number one strategy of the Pharisees was shame and fear, and I hate to admit it, but I think there's always a spirit of Pharisees when in like institutions and religions, so just to be cognizant of that, that's really powerful. I think for me, when I was kind of going through my trauma stuff, and we can kind of talk about like when was it that we were like, okay, I think I need help, right? Like that kind of
Yeah.
moment for us. And for me, when I was doing my own trauma work, so my trauma work had to happen before road to forgiveness. And forgiveness is a whole another topic, right? Like church says, oh, you just need to forgive and turn the other cheek. Well, it's really hard when you're carrying like 200-pound, backpack with you all the time. And it's a lot of trauma symptoms that you're working through. So I think just to kind of reiterate what we're saying is that there's a natural course of ups and downs in this journey of mental and spiritual health. And I think when people are like, oh, you just need to do that, like that's the end goal. So just get there faster. I feel like I tried that and it always backfired on me and at everybody involved, so just to kind of honor that process is so powerful. But for me, when I recognized, wow, I have a lot of baggages coming from my trauma and like, my upbringing, what I experienced was I was the word flooded with memories and feelings like all at once. It was almost like I was able to kind of tame it and put it under the rug or like in a box for a long time. And when I got serious about, okay, I need to actually forgive and move forward, it's almost like that box opened up and all the junk and garbage started to come out. And I was getting kind of like, number one, overwhelmed. Okay, this is a lot. And number two, my usual style is go deep and go, like rub salt in my wound and get out of it. Like that was my style. But for the first time, I felt like I can't do that approach. Like this is just too much for me to do my old ways of fixing things. And that's why I was like, I actually got a therapist not to heal faster, but heal slower because I knew that I didn't want to rush it, or fake it. So I was like, I need somebody to kind of listen to my story, catch all the nuances and, my blind side because I wanted to do this right, and that was my incentive to get a therapist. How about you, Beatrice?
I think mine was, I let my situation get to where I was just miserable. I didn't know the signs. I'm speaking specifically of when I went through postpartum depression. I'd had some trauma that I didn't get a chance to deal with right afterwards I gave birth. So those two things just kind of loaded the gun. And then, I experienced pretty bad postpartum depression, but I didn't know the symptoms. So I let the symptoms get really bad and go on for quite a while. And so while I can't say I ever reached the point of feeling suicidal, I did reach the point where I have what we call a passive death wish, where you just wish that you could die, because it's so overwhelming to deal with the physical feelings that you're dealing with, the crying and the inability to focus and couldn't get out of bed and just even some achiness. And then just the emotions, the roller coaster of emotions, the guilt that I would feel, for not being a good employee, for not being a good wife and a mom. And then just the shame, like, what is wrong with me? Like, I should be able to pull myself out of this, like, get out of bed and function. Come on, what's wrong with you? So I would talk negatively to myself about how I was coping. And I think all of that, just the frustration with feeling miserable in life, I was like, I need help. I don't care what kind of help. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I know I need help. And so my mom was actually suggesting to me, I think you're dealing with depression. And I thought, no, I'm not. Like, depression is crying all day, every day, and I'm not doing that. I'm able to get up and go to work. I'm not functioning well at work, but and I would put on a mask all day and then come home and be absolutely exhausted because it required so much of me to be, on my A game all day long at work. Then I come home and there's nothing left for my family because I'm exhausted. So I think that for me was just feeling like there is something very wrong. I am not coping very well and I am absolutely overwhelmed and miserable. So I finally reached the point where I went back to my doctor, like my mom had been saying all along. And I told her what was going on, and she diagnosed me, with clinical depression. And I reluctantly went on medication. There was a relief in knowing that there was a name for what I had and that it could be treated. But I wasn't really excited about being on medication because I thought that it meant, well, you're weak and you're not able to cope very well. You're not a strong woman. So we have to give you these meds, So there was some guilt there to that, but man, after being on the medication, I felt like I had come back from the dead. Like all of a sudden now I felt like myself again. And it's not a happy pill. It did not make me happy. I still had to see a therapist. I still had to work through, what had happened to me before I had given birth. But I felt so much better and I could see God again and I felt like myself again. And I could take care of my child and I could take care of my home and I could work. It was still a struggle, but I guess I would encourage people, like, don't let it get so bad, that you wish for death and that you're miserable every day. If you're experiencing, the feeling of I'm crawling through life and I can't cope. I feel like I'm drowning and I'm just doing a good job to keep my head above water every day. That is not thriving and living, right? That is struggling and you don't have to live like that. Your quality of life when it's like that, you're beyond needing help, right? And I think sometimes we have this image of mental illness is that person that's walking down the street and their hands are flying and they're having an argument with
Yeah.
themselves or
Yeah.
they're yelling at the cars that are driving by and you're
Mm-hmm.
like crazy, either high or crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it falls on the spectrum. Like maybe that person is, at the far end and they really do need to be in a psychiatric ward. I don't know. Maybe they're just high. But at the other end, where you're not coping and you feel very overwhelmed and you're just crawling through life and your quality of life is not good, that should be a red flag.
Mm.
That's a point where we need to talk to somebody and get help and ask questions like, what's wrong? Like, this isn't me. And I don't feel like I'm living life the way that I used to. Especially if you've lost interest in things that you used to enjoy. I had a client, who really enjoyed riding horses and she just kind of quit riding horses. And so, we started exploring that and discovered there's some depression there. So when there's been a change like that in your thinking, in your behavior, and the things that you used to love and anger. Anger is one of the ones that, I think we overlook.
Mm-hmm.
Irritability and anger can be depression as well.
Yeah.
But when you're feeling like that, it's time to talk to somebody.
Yeah. And I love that your mom and a family member was there to kind of catch your blind side and be like, hey, like, what's going on? Like, I think this, like, what do you think? And it's such an asset in our lives to have those people kind of speak truth and grace in our lives. But it was interesting because when your mom was like, hey, Beatrice, I think this is depression. Like, why don't you go get help? I know that you said, and when we talked in the discovery call, you were like, yeah, absolutely not. No, it's not. Like, I can do this. I can do that. There's a lot of internal arguments that we have, that prevents us from seeking help. And like, let's talk about that. Like, what were some of the rationalization or reasons that you were like, no, that's not it.
I think that's what we call the stigma, right? Like nobody
Mm,
wants to admit that they're struggling mentally. We're really quick to admit we're struggling with something physically. People send us good, get well cards and flowers and maybe they bring us a meal. But if you say you're struggling with something mentally, like people don't know what to do with that. And you don't want to be
yeah.
labeled as weak or crazy. So I think that's what kept me from talking about it and or seeking help is I don't want to be perceived as weak. I'm a strong woman. I don't want to be perceived as not able to deal with whatever I need to deal with, right? I'm capable. Um, and then I didn't want to be perceived as, there's something mentally wrong with you. So I just continued, like I said, going to work and keeping the mask on, but it was exhausting. But that's the
Mm,
stigma, that we have in our society is it's okay for you to struggle with something spiritually or physically, but you can't struggle with anything mentally, and our
yeah.
minds, sometimes they don't function right. I think all of us, we talk to ourselves. We talk to ourselves in ways that we call it negative self-talk. What is wrong with you? You should be able to handle this. Get out of bed. You're being lazy. Everybody, deals with depression once in a while. Why aren't you coping with it better? And so I think that's part of it is just not wanting to admit that there's something wrong and then interpreting that as if there is something wrong, then I'm a weak person or crazy,
Right. And
right?
it
That's the other
and it's
favorite
like,
word is we're crazy.
yeah, and it's like self-fulfilling prophecy, and we talk about that a lot in therapy, is like you think they'll perceive you as weak, so even when you're struggling, you don't get help. you talk down to yourself. Oh, see, this is another reason why you're weak or you're struggling, and that means that you're less than. And then you're struggling even more because you're getting weighed down in both ends, perceived notion, other people's comments and like internal negative self-talk. And then you actually do get weaker to prove, quote unquote, prove that you are actually weak. And that is the path of mental health issues turning into a struggle. And at certain point we have to break the cycle and be like, okay, it's not just me. And I hope that this episode kind of gives people hope that it's like, okay, this is not just me. I don't have to be silent in my sufferings. And like, I need to, and I want to, and maybe I deserve to get help. And I think for me, when I was kind of getting overwhelmed and I was like, maybe I need to see a therapist or something like that.
Hey guys, this is Dr. Eugene Kim. I'm so glad that you're here. I hope that you're finding great insight and fun and laughter and hope in this episode. I just wanted to kind of take a little break to tell you and ask you to sign up for my email newsletter. There will be a link in the description box, whether it's an Apple Podcast, Spotify, or YouTube. And if you sign up for this email newsletter, then you'll be the first one to know what's going on. Sometimes I do some activities in the YouTube and not podcast, vice versa. So this way that you don't miss out on the work that I'm doing. And also, if you subscribe to the platform that is your favorite, then you won't be missing out on the episode that comes out on your platform. And this will help me to kind of generate a bigger audience so that they will know that good news in Christianity and also psychiatry and mental health can make sense together. So thank you so much for your time listening to this announcement, and let's go back to the episode.
Honestly, if I had to put a category on it, it was like low self-worth. And not in a womp womp, like I'm the worst in the face of the earth, not that degree, but it was like, if my kid was sick, I'm more than willing to pay for his doctor's appointment, right? But it was so hard for me to spend money for my care. If my kid is coughing and I'm like paying attention, like, oh my gosh, he's coughing, like let me check his throat, like, let me cut his nails because they're getting too long. Like my attention goes to other people so much, but I really had to argue with myself the amount of attention that goes to other people. What if you borrowed 10, 20% of that? Like not all, you're not going to be selfish. And I know that you don't want to be selfish, but what if you borrowed 10% of that attention that goes to other people to you? And maybe, willingness to spend money on medical and mental health care, you are willing to do that for other people. What if you borrowed like 10% of that allowance, like permitting yourself to get those help? And if I really am still struggling with it, but it was that my worth and how well I do and attention that I need to be well, like it was equal to the next person. And that was a really one of the transformative truths that I had to, and I'm still working on to accept.
Yeah, I like to tell my clients, self-care is really important, but I worry that when I say that, they think that I'm saying you need to put yourself up here all the time and be arrogant and selfish, right? And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you've been putting yourself down below and not taking care of your needs. And I'm asking you to put yourself to where you are equal to everybody else. Your needs are just as important as anybody else's. You've been doing this, which is I'm not important and I don't take care of my needs, and everybody else is up here. And I'm just asking you to say, I'm just like any other human being. I have needs and I need to take care of them so that I can take care of my kids, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm not saying, be selfish, put yourself ahead of everybody else and be arrogant. So I always have to explain, I'm not saying that. I'm saying this. You have to remember that you're a human being too, and you have needs. Anyway, I hope that addresses what you were saying.
Yeah. And I think so I'm working on always kind of putting myself level with other people, which is a struggle, but I always went like that. But what I realized in my life is that when I put my needs last, it actually backfires on everybody too. So it's like I get fed up with how I'm not being taken care of, or like, let's say like laundry, right? Everybody's throwing their socks everywhere. I'm cleaning everything up and I'm doing it silently, suffering silently. And one day, maybe aligned with my menstrual cycle, I don't know, something happens and I blow up on everybody. It's like, I've been collecting your socks around the house like all day, every day of this month and blah, blah, blah. And then they're just kind of like, whoa, like if that was the issue, then just tell us ahead of time. And I think it's almost like a preventative mental health care if you think of yourself and your needs like equal. And then because we think it's a good Samaritan thing to do to put ourselves lower and always like bleed out for other people, but actually it just backfires because it just makes everybody bitter, you know, unwilling to ask for help, unwilling to get help, and then so irritable, you lash out at everybody, you judge everybody around you. And it's just like really funny because I had that dynamic with me and my husband where I feel like I'm doing everything, and he's just like happy go lucky. And we always had this joke. We always had the joke that my husband and I were like a duck, and he's the duck above the water. He looks so serene and just like swimming through, and I'm the leg under the water going like that, killing myself so that he looks good on the. So that was a joke, and that was like our dynamic for a long time. And I was just always bitter, always burnt out. And God really challenged me one morning or one night, and he said, he was like, Eugene, I know that you are really tired. I know that you're doing a lot. And I know that you feel like he's not doing enough around the house or maybe planning or something like that. But did you think about how much it costs your family to be with a bitter and angry woman all the time? Who's burnt out?
Yeah.
There's a cost to that too. And then I was like, wow. I was like, God, and I told him, I was like, God, I don't want to be bitter and burnt out and angry anymore. Like, show me a different way. And it was actually putting my needs just like everyone else. Like, that was the treatment, prescribed by God, saying you don't have to put your needs last. You can actually put it equal. And I was like, wow, that really cured a burnout, and being bitter, because I'm like, no, I need to do this and say more no's, and so that I can say more yeses later.
Yeah, it's great having a mom who's practicing self-care, right? And a wife who's practicing self-care because
Yeah.
they're not grouchy and, snapping at you, they're actually happy and, able to be a better mom and a wife. But that also makes me think of something else. One of the other arguments about seeking mental health is that we're told that if you see a therapist or a mental health professional, they're going to want you to pay attention to your feelings only, right?
Mm,
And so I just want to say that, we're all aware of that scripture that says, the heart is deceitful, among all things. And so I don't believe that we should only pay attention to our feelings and let them be the steering wheel of the car, but they are like lights on a dashboard, right? They're
mm,
signals. And when you're feeling something, you need to pay attention to that signal and ask, okay, why am I feeling that? So we don't say, suppress your feelings, don't feel what you feel, ignore them because all feelings are bad. We say, pay attention and be curious, like ask questions. I like to tell my clients if the dashboard, the check engine light comes on your dashboard and you take a piece of duct tape and put it over that light, have you solved your problem? No, we haven't solved the problem, right? The light tells us there's something under the hood. We need to pay attention to this. So I just want to put that out there that, it is important to pay attention to feelings. They're not a good steering wheel because feelings change and they can be deceitful, right? They can make us think something is really, really important. And then later we're like, well, it really wasn't that important. But at the time it seemed that way, right? So they
mm-hmm.
can change and they can be deceitful. But, we need to pay attention to them because I think, God has given those for a reason. They give us some clues to things that we do need to be paying attention to.
Yeah. And I love that analogy. Thank you for reminding, because we had that analogy, and I think there are some people who look at the social media reels on like, do you have ADHD? Do you have autism? Do you have, trauma? And then I feel like overreacting to those TikToks and like social media posts It's kind of like you look at one engine light and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to go to the car shop, and like I need to fix everything. I need to get a new car. People just abandon their cars, and just like get a new car with every single engine light. And I'm just like, okay, you have to put into context, right? And then it's like when the check engine light is on, just like you said, I love the word curiosity. It's like, okay, what's going on here? Do I hear something? Do I smell something? It's like, is my accelerator kind of going at the same time that I'm pressing it? You study things and you stay curious to your car. And sometimes check engine light goes off on its own sometimes, but if it comes on and on again, I think those are really signs that, hey, maybe you need to get it to the mechanic and get a diagnostic test. And I think I love that example. And I just, this episode, I hope that we're not saying that overreact to your emotions and, but maybe don't ignore it, but don't freak out about it either. It's just kind
Yeah.
of, it's part of the condition that we are in, but stay curious and stay attentive to yourself, because it's important. And nobody knows what's going on in your thought and in your heart more than you do. And it's like, give yourself credit for that, and just kind of observe it and things like that. And when you were talking about emotions, yeah, there's so many verses that gets like misquoted and misused. And it's like, and I started to say that emotions are window to our soul is something, when we talk about the cognitive triad, there's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, right? Emotions is a beautiful aspect of ourselves that really shows us what's going on in our souls. And I use it to really figure out how our spiritual inner child is doing. And it's a shame if like we just minimize and ignore feeling sad and feeling anxious and feeling lonely, because if we were curious to that, the spiritual truth is that that's our condition, as a child, and we're going to go back home. And to kind of, maybe to the audience who are churchgoers or in Christian church who has some stigmas on mental health or maybe reading your emotions, what if discovering your sadness and feeling lonely and maybe feeling inadequate and weak, what if it enlightens you to our true spiritual condition on this earth to give you hope that this is not it, And like, what if we confidently own that story of grace and truth and salvation and sanctification? I think that would be a beautiful movement in church.
I love that. Yeah. To really, have something good come out of something that we might perceive as bad, right? That God does
Yeah.
do that. He brings good out of bad and may put us on an amazing journey to learn some things about ourselves that bring us, goodness in our life and quality of life.
And I
But we have to
wonder,
be curious, right? We have to be curious and ask questions.
we have to be curious and we have to be brave. And I think,
Brave.
speaking of brave, I wonder if there's anyone here who's like, well, my family member is having suicidal thoughts, or maybe they're layperson counselor. And a lot of the comments that I hear from layperson or a staff member at church or school, they're like, we're not trained to handle this kind of uncomfortable emotions, right? And you're right, you're not trained to do that. And, look out the resources in your local area who are, equipped to handle that kind of severe, suicidal thoughts and mental health crisis. But I think curiosity and brave, what I want the audience to kind of understand is that it doesn't take trained knowledge, to be equipped and stand next to somebody. I think it takes bravery and curiosity, not in the confidence of our training that we have on earth, but God's ability to handle anything, right? And I know that we're entering the theological realm, but do you have any tips for people who are like, okay, Dr. Kim just said, like, be confident in the truth of God, right? Sounds churchy, sounds biblically, but like, do you have any tips for people who are like, I have a family member, I have a friend struggling with it, I'm not trained, like, how can I stay curious and brave in this situation?
I mean, just showing, that you're interested and saying things like, how long have you been feeling this way? And just kind of asking some questions like, okay, you say you're sad. Like, tell me what that looks like for you, and just allow them to speak about what they're experiencing because they may not feel comfortable talking about it because they think, well, no one's going to understand, or I don't want to burden anybody. I don't want to put any kind of burden on somebody by telling them all of these sad things. So giving them the opportunity to just talk about it, I think that call that the ministry of presence, right? Just being present with them. I think sometimes you were talking earlier about how we just kind of want to have this solution. We just need to do this. That's not helpful. Like when you're really struggling, you may not even have the energy to do anything, and you just feel so hopeless, like there isn't an answer. And so just having someone sit and be with you and ask a few questions and not try to solve it, I think is a great thing. What do you think?
Yeah, I love that. And there's also ministry of silence
Mhm.
and just giving them space just to feel the feels. And second was empathy. I'm referring a lot to our marriage problems. But, whenever I have a lot of like stress or like problems, typical, stereotypical response of my husband was like, well, then do this, then do that, and then I had to like rationalize what empathy is and give him like a prompt, so I was like, okay, I'm feeling this. Can you go back to your memory data and remember if you felt like this too, So then he was like, oh, okay, so let me, and then he kind of gave me space and then he'll go back to his memory box and think, when was the last time I felt really frustrated that despite my effort, the outcome didn't work out, So then he learned, and then another therapist friend was like, you just basically taught him how to empathize. And I was like, I guess I did. But when when you have somebody that you love and you care about struggling, hearing their story, asking questions, and these are data that these are really powerful human experience data, right? And more often than not, you might have a similar human experience that you can relate to, and maybe you felt alone. Maybe you felt not good enough. Maybe you felt like no matter how hard you try, you're just always, you know, bottomed out. When was the last time that you felt like that? And just hold that feeling in your heart and give them space. And this interesting thing about empathy is that it's not just an emotional experience, it's a spiritual experience. If you know what I mean, it's like when I am empathizing with my patients, no matter like I can say a lot of smart things, but more often than not, the space that I hold in my heart and empathizing with them and the silence is what brings more healing, and that is powerful.
Yes, because sometimes the things that we say in trying to solve the problem actually end up hurting and or making them feel worse, right?
Yeah.
My husband and I have a policy. He asks me when I start, talking, is this something that I need to just listen, or do you need me to help you solve a problem? And
Yeah.
if I say
Yep.
I just want to vent and I just want you to listen, he kind of sits back and goes, "Okay, good. I don't have to worry
Yeah.
about figuring this out. I can just listen, right?" So
Yeah.
I sometimes I say that with friends, like, wait, am I helping you solve a problem, or you just need to vent and I just need to listen, right? So maybe you need to ask that, are you
Yeah.
needing help to solve this, or you just want to vent and, talk to me? Because I can do either one.
Yeah. That's a really good question. And I think it should be more normalized because um and this a whole another episode is like we all want to fix problems,
Mm-hmm.
you know, out of our own discomfort, or we just
Mm-hmm.
want to rescue people, from their discomfort. And the art is to not do that and be present, give them space, and feel the feels next to the person.
And to be comfortable doing that.
hmm And that's why I say that you have to be brave, because I think a lot of times when people are like, oh, you just need to pray more, you just need to go to church, their intention could have been, well, like
Yeah.
that I don't want you to suffer anymore, so here's my solution. But you really need to be brave with not having a solution and being present with the uncomfortable and negative, unhelpful emotions.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. Be brave.
Yeah. Um, I just hope that every, I just hope and I just know that people who are listening in a different, you know, audience category, whether you're personally struggling, you've been a silent sufferer for maybe your whole life, and you didn't know who to go to. I hope that this episode gave you hope that, actually raising the importance of your needs and your suffering and your pain is actually preventative and is helpful for you and also everybody around you. And I hope that people who are maybe Christian therapists or Christian psychiatrists, who's listening to this is like, oh, there is a bridge, to incorporate my faith into practice. And I hope that we kind of gave you some perspectives on that. And also layperson or just people who are just really interested in the merge of, mental and spiritual healthcare, and they just don't know how to handle it when their loved one is struggling. I hope that we gave you some pointers to be brave and stay curious and how to be present with people that you love.
Yes, because Christianity and mental health can coexist, right?
Absolutely. And I think can be very synergistic and powerful when it comes
Yes.
together. Beatrice,
Yes.
thank you so much for your time. How can my audience find you and your work?
Thank you for inviting me. This has been fun. I love talking about mental health and Christianity. My office is here in San Antonio near Stone Oak and Sonterra. I have in-person visits and virtual. And I love helping people. So come find me. I'm at solutionsforthesoul.com.
Yes, definitely. I'll put all the links below. And then when this episode go live, I'll tag her social media page so that you can kind of know more about Beatrice and the wonderful work that she does. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great day.